Okay, so we're starting to read Great Gatsby, and before we start chapter 1, the big things that I think you guys should know, it's narrated by this guy named Nick. Nick kind of thinks his view of the world is going to be the best view of the world, so he's going to be like kind of critical of people. You're going to really see, you want to like pay attention to the way he describes the different characters that he interacts with. So his perceptions of Gatsby, his perceptions of his cousin. So he's Daisy's cousin. He ends up deciding to move out to outside of New York City for the summer, and he's going to write, and it's going to be great. And then he meets this guy named Gatsby, who we don't know, and he doesn't know, and there's like all this mystery and intrigue. So chapter 1 is just going to introduce you to a bunch of the key characters. So you want to pay attention to Nick. What do we learn about him based on who he is as a narrator? You're going to meet Tom and Daisy. Daisy is Nick's cousin. Tom is her husband. Pay attention to the kind of man Tom is. Pay attention to how he treats his wife, how he's described, what's important to him. Pay attention to who Daisy is, the kinds of things that she hopes for, that she longs for, the relationship that she has with Tom. And then we'll meet some of the minor characters. You'll meet Jordan, who's like this girl that Nick ends up kind of dating a little bit. So you just want to pay attention to this world that Gatsby's trying, or that Fitzgerald is trying to create. And the last big thing to know before we start reading chapter 1 is Fitzgerald is writing at a time period where they're in a whole new genre or a whole new era of writing. And so he's really rebelling to all of the standard writing conventions that came before him. So this is right after World War I. Everyone is coming home from war, and they're angry and they're disillusioned with society and all these things that we thought were important, you know, and then these boys, these young men, go off to war, they fight in the trenches, and then they come back. And now they're like seeing America from a new perspective. And so Fitzgerald is one of those men who's come back to America. Fitzgerald the author, he's come back to America. You know, he's seeing the world and he's seeing it with all of its flaws, right? We call this the disillusionment with the American dream, this idea that the things that we think are important, materialism and wealth, and so-and-so it has it all together because they have all the money. That is not how Fitzgerald views the world. And so pay attention to the way he kind of subtly uses Nick to show us how shallow and superficial this upper class is. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 1, page 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me, and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person, and so it came about that in college I was unjustly accused of being a politician, because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently I feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms of which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments as a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat. A sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with the flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift of hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. And so you'll notice there's 3 little dots there, so he's going to shift back. So just a few key things to keep in mind here before we kind of jump back in the story. This is going to be one of those nonlinear plots. So Nick, he uses I. That doesn't mean Fitzgerald. That's talking about Nick. Nick is our narrator, and he is a writer. So Nick, our narrator, Nick, not Fitzgerald, Nick the character, is a writer who's going to be reflecting back and telling us this story of Gatsby and his experiences with him. And so just pay attention to those last lines, right? That foreshadowing that this story is not going to end well. It ends, no, Gatsby turned out all right in the end. It is what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. So Nick, our narrator, Nick the writer, Nick the character, has completely given up hope in mankind. He's kind of lost his sense that mankind is good, and so we're going to discover why that is throughout the story. Okay, so we're on page 3. Now we're going back, and Nick is going to start the story from the beginning. He's going to give his family background and then introduce the characters. Page 3. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in the Midwestern city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch, but the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great-uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915, just a quarter century after my father, and a little later I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raids so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Midwest now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everyone I knew was in the bond business, so I suppose I could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave and hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays I came east, permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month. But at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away, and an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed, cooked breakfast, and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so, Until one morning some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great burst of leaves growing on the trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. And notice his tone of voice here, how different it is. He's like sparkling, he's excited, he's full of life. And that's so different from just a page ago. He's going back in time, remember, nothing has happened yet. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Maecenas know. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again that most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was just a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, two unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out in the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They're not perfect ovals like the eggs in the Columbus story. They are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is the most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for $12,000 or $15,000 a season. Okay, remember, he's paying $80 a month. $12,000 or $15,000 are his neighbors. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hôtel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gatsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gatsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked, so I had a view of the water, partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and a consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the courtesy bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water, and the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I had known Tom in college, and just after the war I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. Her husband, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21, that everything afterward savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came to the East, I don't know. They spent a year in France for no particular reason, then drifted here and there unrestfully, wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on forever seeking, a little wistfully, for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walks and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the sides in bright vines as though from a momentum of its run, the front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the windy, warm afternoon. And Tom Buchanan in riding clothes was standing with legs apart on the front porch. He had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. Two shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of the body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage. A cruel body. His speaking voice, a gruff, husky tenor, added to the impression of fractiousness he conveyed. There was a touch of paternal contempt in it, even toward people he liked, and there were men at New Haven who hated his guts. Now, don't think my opinion on these matters is final, he seemed to say, just because I'm stronger and more of a man than you are. We were in the same senior society, and while we were never intimate, I always had the impression that he approved of me, and wanted me to like him with some harsh, defiant wistfulness of his own. So we talked for a few minutes on the sunny porch. "I've got a nice place here," he said, his eyes flashing about restlessly. Turning me around by one arm, he moved a broad, flat hand along the front vista, including in its sweep a sunken Italian garden, a half-acre of deep, pungent roses, and a snub-nosed motorboat that bumped the tide offshore. It belonged to Germain, the oil man. He turned me around again, politely and abruptly. "We'll go inside." We walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up toward the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch on which two young women were buoyed up, as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling. Ow, 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 cat! Sorry, I have cats, and they were trying to come on my lap with their claws. Okay. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains and the groan of a picture on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the caught wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the two young women ballooned slowly to the floor. The younger of the two was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little, as if she were balancing something on which it was quite likely to fall. If she saw me out of the corner of her eye, she gave no hint of it. Indeed, I was almost surprised into murmuring an apology for having disturbed her by coming in. The other girl, Daisy, made an attempt to rise. She leaned slightly forward with a conscientious expression. Then she laughed an absurd, charming little laugh, and I laughed too and came forward into the room. I'm paralyzed with happiness. She laughed again as if she said something very witty, and held my hand for a moment looking up into my face, promising that there was no one in the world she had so much wanted to see. That was a way she had. She hinted in a murmur that the surname of the balancing girl was Baker. I've heard it said that Daisy's murmur was only to make people lean toward her, an irrelevant criticism that made it no less charming. At any rate, Miss Baker's lips fluttered. She nodded at me almost imperceptibly, then quickly tipped her head back again. The object she was balancing had obviously tottered a little and given her something of a fright. Again, a sort of apology rose to my lips, almost an exhibition of complete self-sufficiency draws a stunned tribute from me. I looked back at my cousin, who began to ask me questions in her low, thrilling voice. It was the kind of voice that the ear follows up and down as if each speech is an arrangement of notes that will never be played again. Her face was sad and lovely, with bright things in it, bright eyes and a bright, passionate mouth, but there was an excitement in her voice that men who cared for her found difficult to forget, a singing compulsion, a whispered, "Listen," a promise that she had done gay, exciting things just a while since, and that there were gay, exciting things hovering in the next hour. I told her how I had stopped off in Chicago for a day on my way east, and how a dozen people sent their love through me. "Do they miss me?" she cried ecstatically. "The whole town is desolate. All the cars have left, rear wheel painted black as a mourning wreath, and there's a persistent wail all night along the North Shore. Oh, how gorgeous! Let's go back, Tom, tomorrow." Then she added irrelevantly, "You ought to see the baby." "I'd like to." "She's asleep. She's 3 years old. Haven't you ever seen her?" "Never." "Well, you ought to see her. She's—" Tom Buchanan, who had been hovering restlessly about the room, stopped and rested his hand on my shoulder. "What are you doing, Nick?" "I'm a bond man." "Who with?" I told him. "Never heard of them," he remarked decisively. This annoyed me. "You will," I answered shortly. "You will if you stay in the East." "Oh, I'll stay in the East, don't you worry," he said, glancing at Daisy and then back at me, as if he were alert for something more. "I'll be a goddamn fool to live anywhere else." At this point, Miss Baker said, "Absolutely," with such suddenness that I started. It was the first word she had uttered since I came into the room. Evidently it surprised her as much as it did me, for she yawned and with a series of rapid, deft movements stood up into the room. "I'm stiff," she complained. "I've been lying on that sofa for as long as I can remember." "Don't look at me," Daisy retorted. "I've been trying to get you to go to New York all afternoon." "No thanks," said Miss Baker, to the 4 cocktails just in from the pantry. "I'm absolutely in training." Her host looked at her incredulously. "You are?" He took down his drink as if it were a drop in the bottom of a glass. "How do you ever get anything done is beyond me." I looked at Miss Baker, wondering what it was she got done. I enjoyed looking at her. She was a slender, small-breasted girl with an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backward at the shoulders like a young cadet. Her gray, sun-strained eyes looked back at me with a polite, reciprocal curiosity out of a wan, charming, discontented face. It occurred to me now that I had seen her, or a picture of her somewhere before. "You live in West Egg?" she remarked contemptuously. "I know somebody there." "I don't know a single—" "You must know Gatsby." "Gatsby?" demanded Daisy. "What Gatsby?" Before I could reply that he was my neighbor, dinner was announced. Wedging his tense arm imperatively under mine, Tom Buchanan compelled me from the room as though he were moving a checker to another square. Slenderly, languidly, their hands set lightly on their hips, the 2 young women preceded us out into a rosy-colored porch, open toward the sunset, where 4 candles flickered on the table in the diminished wind. "Why candles?" objected Daisy, frowning. She snapped them out with her fingers. "In 2 weeks it'll be the longest day of the year." She looked at us all radiantly. "Do you always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it?" "I always watch for the longest day of the year and then miss it." "We ought to plan something," yawned Miss Baker, sitting down at the table as if she was getting into bed. "All right," said Daisy. "What'll we plan?" She turned to me helplessly. "What do people plan?" Before I could answer, her eyes fastened with an odd expression on her little finger. "Look," she complained. I heard it. We all looked. The knuckle was black and blue. You did it, Tom, she said accusingly. I know you didn't mean to, but you did do it. That's what I get for marrying a brute of a man, a great, big, hulking, physical specimen of a... I hate that word, hulking, objected Tom crossly, even in kidding. Hulking, insisted Daisy. Sometimes she and Miss Baker talked at once, unobtrusively, with a bantering inconsequence that was never quite chatter, that was as cool as their white dresses and their impersonal eyes in the absence of all desire. They were here, and they accepted Tom and me, making only a polite, pleasant effort to entertain or to be entertained. They knew that presently dinner would be over, and a little later the evening, too, would be over and casually put away. It was sharply different from the West, where an evening was hurried from phase to phase towards its end, in a continually disappointed anticipation, or else in sheer nervous dread of the moment itself. You make me feel uncivilized, Daisy, I confessed in my second glass of porky but rather unimpressive claret. Can't you talk about crops or something? I meant nothing in particular by this remark, but it was taken up in an unexpected way. Civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Emperors by this man Goddard? Why, no, I answered, rather surprised by his tone. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's all been proved. Tom's getting very profound, said Daisy, with an expression of unthoughtful sadness. He reads deep books with long words in them. What was that word? Well, these books are all scientific, insisted Tom, glancing at her impatiently. This fellow has worked out the whole thing. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch out for the other races will have control of things. We've got to beat them down, whispered Daisy, winking ferociously toward the fervent sun. We ought to live in California, began Miss Baker, but Tom interrupted her by shifting heavily in his chair. The idea is that we're Nordics. I am, and you are, and with an infinitesimal hesitation, he included Daisy with a slight nod, and she winked at me again. And we've produced all the things that go to make civilization. Oh, science and art and all that. Do you see? There was something pathetic in his concentration, as if his complacency, more acute than of old, was not enough to him any more. When almost immediately the telephone rang inside and the butler left the porch, Daisy seized upon the momentary interruption and leaned toward me. I'll tell you a family secret, she whispered enthusiastically. It's about the butler's nose. Do you want to hear about the butler's nose? That's why I came over tonight. Well, he wasn't always a butler. He used to be the silver polisher for some people in New York that had a silver service for 200 people. He had to polish it from morning till night until finally it began to affect his nose. Things went from bad to worse, suggested Miss Baker. Yes, things went from bad to worse until finally he had to give up his position. For a moment the last sunshine fell with romantic affection upon her glowing face. Her voice compelled me forward, breathlessly, as I listened. Then the glow faded, each light deserting her with lingering regret, like children leaving a pleasant street at dusk. The butler came back and murmured something close to Tom's ear, whereupon Tom frowned, pushed back his chair, and without a word went inside, as if his absence quickened something within her. Daisy leaned forward again, her voice glowing and singing. I'd love to see you at my table, Nick. You remind me of a rose, an absolute rose, doesn't he? She turned to Miss Baker for confirmation. An absolute rose. This was untrue. I'm not even faintly like a rose. She was only extemporizing, but a stirring warmth flowed from her, as if her heart was trying to come out to you, concealed in one of those breathless, thrilling words. Then suddenly she threw her napkin on the table, excused herself, and went into the house. Okay, so I'm going to pause there with this video for those of you who want to divide up your reading. So this is the first 30 minutes. We've got a little bit more to finish the chapter. I'm ending in the middle of page 14. Okay.